Welcome to this video, which will be demonstrating what can be considered as credible sources of reference, ones that you can use in your assignments, and ones to be aware of, which are less credible. So first port of call really is your reading list. Your reading list is compiled by your lecturers who have obviously authority on the subject and who will spend time with their librarians as well to help compile an up-to-date reading list on the subject. So first port of call, really we do expect that you do use those, the ones that are relevant to your particular topic. They can often provide a background information as well to get you started. So generally that will be your first port of call. As you start to read the literature that are on your reading lists, then we will encourage you to look at the other sources that are used in those texts as well. Generally, you could find additional references at the end of a chapter of a book, for example, at the end of a journal article, at the end of a book, there might be additional references in there, and you can use those then for independent reading and look for those primary sources of reference as well. Moving beyond the reading list, then obviously you're expected to look for additional sources of reference to demonstrate your research skills and your independent skills in terms of autonomy in finding additional sources of reference. Then textbooks and scholarly books are really important to be looking for, and you'll be able to do searches through the library. In the catalogue search to look for books, you can obviously go into the library and you can look on for ebooks as well. So we use Open Athens. You can search through eBook Central and EBSCO ebooks. So something that's really important to bear in mind is the level that you're working at. So at university you're working at level 4 and upwards. So using a level 3 BTEC book, for example, perhaps you're studying business studies, wouldn't be appropriate to use as a source of reference. However, you might also still find that it gives you some background information and knowledge to get you going. So what you might find is that there will be books and other sources of reference that you find really, really helpful, which you won't use to reference in your assignment. For us, we are looking at a reference list rather than a bibliography, so no background reading, purely just the books that or other sources of reference that you have used specifically within your assignment to be referenced in your reference list. But they can get you going anyway. So textbooks, scholarly books, always ask for recommendations from your lecturers. The reading list is never going to be really long because you're just going to get a background information to start with, but there are always going to be other books that you can use, and your lecturers will always be happy to help you with that, and also speak to your peers to find out what they're reading as well. Now we move on, so beyond books, then we can also move on to journal articles being typically research-based articles by researchers on a particular topic. Sometimes they're primary research where they've actually carried out the research themselves, or it can be secondary research where the researchers will be studying other research that's already been has already happened. And now the creme de la creme of research articles are ones that have been peer reviewed, and what that means is that other experts in the field have reviewed those articles and the research process and have acknowledged that that's a credible piece of research, demonstrating trustworthiness within that. So if you are looking for journal articles when you're using Open Athens, for example, if you use the filters on the left hand side, then you can filter for academic journals, but you can also filter for peer-reviewed journals. So go for those ones first. You might use other research databases, so for example researchgate.net or Google Scholar, which will have a range of different sources, but again look for ones that are peer-reviewed to start with. Not all researchers will publish their work in a research journal. Then we've also got academic conference papers, which will be papers that will be presented in a different format, ones that will be presented at a conference, for example, with other esteemed peers as well. You can search for those on Open Athens as well, using the filters on the left hand side. Now we start to move away from those typically academic and scholarly sources, moving into kind of the area of grey literature as it's known, where there are other ways of accessing knowledge, which are typically not from those sources. So an example here would be in industry sources. So within industry and different professions, there will be different professional bodies, for example, that provide information to the public around what is happening in the industry. And these can be really helpful because actually they provide up-to-date information, which typically when publishing a book or a journal article, for example, it can take a considerable amount of time, whereas actually industry sources can publish reports, which are often available online now. And are widely accessible. Something to bear in mind though is when we do use industry sources, and actually this kind of goes the same for books and journals, is think about the context that you're using them in. So for example, if you're studying leadership, you need to think about what context you're studying leadership. So for example, are you studying it in education, or are you studying it in manufacturing? I've had in the past where students have used sources, for example, that are around leadership in manufacturing, then actually, but applying that into educational perspective. But actually, the context is so different, then you need to think about whether or not that's right to use that. Often, the information is quite generic. So, for example, you're studying motivational skills, then it might still be applicable, but at least acknowledge that in your writing, and that will demonstrate criticality, which will be the subject of another video. But just be aware, and I recommend that you speak to your lecturers if you're on work placements. Speak to your colleagues to find out what industry sources are recommended for your area. So other reputable sources then can include government reports and websites. Depending on your subject, you might find those particularly useful. But again, as you are looking at reports and websites, etc., then you need to think about the credibility of those and if anything is missing. So using your critical reading skills again to critique these, understand what subjectivity there might be in there or biases, and any information that potentially could be missing. But these are typically acknowledged as reasonable resources to use. When you are using government-based ones, obviously make sure that you are using the correct government that is related to the country that you are studying. In addition, there are non-governmental organisations and often think tanks associated with specific areas that you might be looking at. So, for example, if you're working with health and social care, then there might be non-government organisations such as the NSPCC, which will provide really good information, often reports, often statistics that you can use. So again, speak to your lecturers, speak to your peers, find out what ones relate to you and your topic. Online sources. So different subjects have a different view on how much reliance should be put on online sources, and that's really important to gauge that with your lecturer in terms of the direction they want you to take. So once to think about them, well, first of all, make sure that you use openathens.net, which is our library database that you can access journals, magazine, industry papers, statistics, etc. So first port of call, using your student ID to access that, then openathens.net is invaluable. Beyond that, you've got Google Scholar as well. So you can create your own account for that and access papers. One of the problems with Google Scholar is that you might not have access to all of the actual articles. So you might just get the abstract rather than the full text article, and then you might actually find that you really don't have a lot of information to go on. But it is a good source. I would use that hand in hand with Open Athens, because not everything that's been published is on all of the databases. I think that's really important to say. You won't be able to access absolutely everything. When you are looking at online sources, it's really important to check out for legitimacy. So looking out for fake news, things that have been reported that don't quite ring true. You might want to think about who are the authors. So if you're looking at online sources, well, what's their background? What's their authority on the subject? Obviously, anyone can set up an internet site, so that is something to be aware of. And to be fair, when you're writing a book, you'd also think about what is the author's authority on the subject. What's their expertise? Are they still an academic? Are they still practicing in the field, for example? So it is really important that you do look for legitimacy, look for the date that it was last updated as well, as an example. So you might have something on the site that actually, when you scroll back, was written 15 years ago. It might not be relevant whatsoever now. If you are using sources of the internet, then think about seeing if you can find other sources to corroborate what is being said, to strengthen your argument in terms of the credibility that you are trying to present. Editable websites such as Wikipedia, to be honest, really helpful, especially to get a background information. So although we've got avoid editable websites, this is just avoid in terms of referencing those. Often you can find right at the bottom of an article on Wikipedia, you'll find some references, and that can be really helpful and start your reading and direction of your reading, or where to go. So don't be put off by looking at these, but we're not going to encourage you to reference those because anyone can edit Wikipedia. So that's important to be aware of. And then thinking about what I've just mentioned about the credibility of those authors, we can't even tell who has written those. Kind of the same principles go with social media. So you might have seen something written on social media, but that typically may come from just one voice. So think about scrutinizing those sources. Typically we say avoid social media, but depending on your subject, you might be studying voices or different perspectives on social media, and then you might be comparing and contrasting things against, say, for example, Twitter and Facebook. So it's not to say that you've got to completely avoid it, but typically you would. But depending on the subject that you're studying, your lecturers will give you more guidance on that. So, and actually, often breaking news tends to come directly, often through social media as well. So the world is changing on that, but you've got to always think about what's their authority on the subject. And similarly with blogs as well. Now, interestingly, in the past, we've sort of said avoid blogs completely, but it's beginning to change now because serious academics and other authoritative voices on a particular subject will now start breaking new news, new information, new research through their blogs. So if you are using blogs, think about the authority on that. For example, in my particular subjects, I wouldn't expect my students to use blogs, but you may be in a different type of subject where that's more encouraged. So please be aware of that. Speak to your lecturers if you're concerned. But the way that you can find out if it's a blog is just look. Typically in the URL, it will say blog somewhere on there in there, and students don't always realise that. So keep an eye out for that. So I'm going to mention essay mills or essay sharing sites. These are illegal in the UK. Avoid using other people's essays to reference in your assignments, which may be available still online depending on where you're looking. So again, make sure you use those credible sources that we've talked about so far. There are some general considerations to make for any sources, and first of all, it's about the date. So we encourage our sources all to be within the last 10 years. Now, are some caveats to that. Now, there may be some seminal authors on the subject. For example, Freud, obviously more than 10 years old, but if you're studying psychoanalysis, then you would still be more than likely referring to Freud. So there will be seminal writers or in the subject that you will be referring to, especially if you are looking at historical perspectives. But what then we will encourage you to do is see whether or not they are still relevant in today's context and use more up-to-date sources of reference to compare and contrast against those seminal writers, but typically within the last 10 years. And it's really important to bear in mind that things can change quite quickly. So something might have been written about it 5 years ago, which may not be relevant anymore. Perhaps legislation has changed since then. Working practice has changed since then. We've recently gone through a worldwide pandemic with COVID-19, which will have changed a number of ways that people work now, and therefore that may have a distinct influence on the sources that you use and are writing about. So be aware of what might be happening in your profession, in your industry, the areas, the topics that you're discussing, when you're thinking about, is this still relevant? And obviously, I think this is something that's come throughout this discussion is around subjectivity. So thinking about, is there any inherent bias? Has the research or the books been sponsored? If you're looking at blogs and other online sources, are there kind of conspiracy theories even related to what's been discussed, or a certain type of inherent bias towards a different type of sort of philosophical perspective that you might have as well? And that goes the same for using newspapers. So we don't make the point that you can't use newspapers, but you do need to think about the professionalism, the political influences, for example, that might be guiding those. So normally we would say typically use broadsheet papers. However, generally all of those have political affiliations. But always bear that in mind. If you want to use those and want to demonstrate your criticality, then acknowledge any inherent biases within those. And that is the end of this presentation. Hopefully it's given you a good idea of the types of sources that you can use. The typical academic ones, then move into that kind of grey literature, and then those areas to really think about whether or not you should be using those sources or not. I wish you all the best with this, and I hope that you have fantastic, really long reference lists which are well read and credible.